Good morning, and thank you so much for having me this morning. I am very honored to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation. I just want to say two quick things before I start. One is how I came to this work. So in addition to being an academic, I am a clinical law professor. I teach students who are representing clients in court in real cases, and I've done that for the last 17 years. Before that, I represented clients myself in a variety of different proceedings involving domestic violence. And so although I'm an academic, I still come to this as a practicing lawyer, and the insights that I have about this really come from my work day in and day out with people who are confronting the legal system in trying to respond to intimate partner violence. Mike is very US heavy, not surprisingly, but I think that it has resonance around the world, in part because the United States has done such an effective job of exporting criminalization of intimate partner violence around the world. Some of you may be aware, for example, that the State Department regularly brings in groups from other countries to hear about, excuse me, my apologies, to hear about the United States response to intimate partner violence. And so, although this is very much based on US law, I think that it has important implications for others as well. Before 1984, in the United States, anti-violence advocates had begun to argue that intimate partner violence should be treated like a crime, just like any other crime. But in 1984, there were three things that happened that really changed the US response to intimate partner violence. The first thing that happened was that the United States Department of Justice convened a task force on family violence. And for the first time, that task force said, domestic violence is a criminal justice problem that requires a criminal justice solution. So the first declaration of federal policy around intimate partner violence. The second thing that happened was a case called Thurman versus City of Torrington, Connecticut. Tracy Thurman had called the police in Torrington, Connecticut repeatedly for years, asking them to intervene to protect her from her husband, Charles, who had long been abusive. This culminated in an assault where Charles came to her house and broke into the house, stabbed her repeatedly. The police came. They saw her laying on the ground. They did not arrest her husband. He was allowed to roam around the scene. He approached her again. He took their small child, picked the child up, and dropped the child on top of her. And the police still did not arrest him. And it wasn't until he approached her for a third time that the police finally made an arrest. Tracy Thurman was left partially paralyzed as a result of this attack. She sued the city of Torrington, Connecticut, and won a multi-million-dollar judgment, $2.3 million in 1984, against the city of Torrington, Connecticut as a result of that assault. Jurisdictions around the country looked up and said, we don't want to have to pay out judgments, multi-million-dollar judgments based on our failure to respond to intimate partner violence. We need to do this differently. And what they saw was the third thing that came up in 1984, which was the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment. The Minneapolis domestic violence experiment looked at the impact of arrest on recidivist violence and found that arrest might have some effect on recidivist violence. Now, at the time, one of the authors of the study, Lawrence Sherman, said, we need to replicate this before we can be certain that arrest has the effect that we think it has, but at the same time was publicizing the study widely. And jurisdictions around the country, looking for ways to insulate themselves from liability, held on to this idea that arrest could be the answer to the problem of intimate partner violence. In the United States, jurisdictions had started to adopt mandatory arrest policies prior to the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment, but it's really after the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment and the Thurman verdict that you see jurisdictions around the country jumping to adopt these policies. So I want to take a step back for a second and just talk about what I mean by criminalization. Criminalization of intimate partner violence can mean several things. First, it can mean enforcement of existing law. So for example, the law of assault has been with us since the English common law, and most domestic violence in the United States is prosecuted as misdemeanor assault. And so the enforcement of existing laws is criminalization. But in the United States, we have also created a number of new laws designed to specifically target intimate partner violence. Laws that criminalize assault when perpetrated against an intimate partner, laws that enhance penalties when intimate partners are victimized. But the real action in the United States has been around process more than substance. And there are two big process changes that are driving criminalization in the United States. The first is one I've already alluded to, which is mandatory arrest. After the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment, jurisdictions all over the country looked at this idea that police discretion was the real problem that needed to be addressed. And anti-violence advocates pushed the idea that police discretion was deeply harmful. Prior to, say, the 1970s, if police went to the scene of a domestic violence incident, they were fairly likely to tell the guy, and it was always a man at that time, and usually a husband at that time, to take a walk around the block, just to go cool down. In fact, the police training manuals of that time say specifically, tell the person to take a walk around the block, but do not make an arrest because this is a private matter. And that idea that intimate partner violence was private was pervasive. Anti-violence advocates pushed back on that and said this is not private, and intimate partner violence, as the Attorney General's task force said, is a crime like any other crime. If police aren't going to use their discretion voluntarily, we need to make them do it. And the way that we make them do it is through mandatory arrest. Mandatory arrest simply means that police must make an arrest whenever they have probable cause to do so. So there is no room for police officers to say, I don't want to make that arrest. Importantly, there's also no room for people who've been subjected to abuse to say, I don't want that arrest made. So mandatory arrest was the first innovation. And not surprisingly, after the inception of mandatory arrest rates rose, but prosecution rates didn't. And so the anti-violence community next turned to prosecutors and said, why is it that you have all of these arrests, but prosecution isn't increasing? Prosecutors said, we can't prosecute because we don't have our star witnesses. The victims don't want to testify. We can't make these cases without them. And two things happened in response to that in the United States. One was something called evidence-based prosecution, the idea that you could prosecute a case of intimate partner violence the way that you would prosecute a homicide, as though there was no live witness to testify, so that you would only have access to the other kinds of evidence, documentary evidence, photographs, recordings, medical records, police records, and that was what you would use to prosecute those cases. But the other thing that happened was something called no-drop prosecution. And no-drop prosecution was adopted by prosecutors who said, we are going to bring these cases forward whenever we can do so, regardless of whether the person who's been harmed wants to bring that case forward or not, regardless of whether they want to be helpful. In soft no-drop prosecution jurisdictions, prosecutors created incentives for people to assist in prosecution, access to victim witness advocates or crime victim compensation funding, other kinds of incentives to get people to testify. In hard no-drop prosecution jurisdictions, by contrast, prosecutors said, we don't care what the victim wants. We will subpoena the victim to testify, subpoena to compel their testimony. And if they fail to comply with the subpoena, we will ask courts to issue arrest warrants to bring them into court. And if they will not testify and we have some fear that they're going to take off, that they're going to be absent at the time of trial, we will ask courts to hold them, to incarcerate them until such time as a trial happens. That's called hard no-drop prosecution. It happens in jurisdictions across the United States. It happens in the jurisdiction where I practice. So victims of violence are arrested for their failure to testify and held until trial. So the real change is not so much around substantive law in the United States, but around process.
Leigh, sorry, I think we have a question from the audience.
Sure.
Debanshan Chapteri. Debanshan, you can ask your question, please. Debanshan, do you have a question? Okay, I guess Maybe the hand was raised just accidentally. We'll get back to you, Debajan, if you re-raise your hand. I'm going to lower it for now. Sorry, Leigh, please go ahead.
No worries. Although the criminal legal response to intimate partner violence was ramping up prior to the passage of the Violence Against Women Act in the United States, the Violence Against Women Act really stakes out the federal government's position that criminalization should be the primary response to intimate partner violence and puts significant resources behind that determination. It's important to understand that the Violence Against Women Act in the United States was part of an omnibus crime bill. So it's very much embedded in the criminal legal system, something called the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, which was heavily promoted by our Democratic presidential candidate, former Vice President Joe Biden. And Biden situated the Violence Against Women Act firmly in the context of criminalization, arguing that Democrats could be just as hard on crime as Republicans could. As a practical matter, VAWA's being cited within the crime bill and its characterization as a part of a scheme of criminalization has had two main effects. First, it's been clear that criminalization is the funding priority for the United States, both in services and in research. And you can see over time how the percentage of VAWA funding dedicated to criminalization has increased. And VAWA is primarily a funding bill. That is mostly what it does. So the fact that most of the funding in what is primarily a funding bill goes to criminalization shows you the federal government's commitment to criminalization. The second thing that dedication to criminalization does, though, is VAWA has been used to promote criminalization policy. So in the first iteration of VAWA in 1994, states were required to adopt mandatory arrest policies if they wanted to receive grant funding. That language has been softened since then. States now must have either mandatory or preferred arrest policies, and preferred arrest policies simply say that we would prefer that police make an arrest in every case where they have probable cause to do so, but enable police to have some amount of discretion still. It's important, too, to situate the criminal legal system response against the context of mass incarceration in the United States. The United States is the largest incarcerator in the world. We currently have 2.3 million people who are incarcerated. Another 5 million people are under the scrutiny of parole and probation officers. And any real attempt to decrease mass incarceration in the United States will require addressing violent crime. So the discourse here early on seemed to be, if we just stop prosecuting drug offenses, we can deal with our problem of mass incarceration. That's simply untrue. As Mark Maurer and David Cole have explained, even if we released everyone imprisoned for drugs tomorrow, the United States would still have 1.7 million people behind bars and an incarceration rate 4 times that of many Western European nations. And while we don't have good data on it, a significant number of those violent offenses are intimate partner violence offenses. In Vermont, for example, 20% of the prison population is incarcerated as a result of intimate partner violence. There's no reason to believe that other states are significantly different. So addressing the criminalization of intimate partner violence has real implications for mass incarceration in the United States.
So again, Leigh, now we do have a question from Sofia Amaral. Sofia, please ask your question.
Hi, Leigh. Pleasure to meet you. So one question, just so I can follow a little bit your talk as we move forward. So when what kind of alternatives should we be thinking on throughout the talk as an alternative to arrest for to think?
We will, that's where we're headed in the talk, but so what we've been talking about in the United States is both prevention and then alternatives to policing. So when we think about arrest, for example, we have to think about what is it that we're hoping to accomplish with arrest. And for many people, it's just to stop that violent incident in the moment, for example, but not necessarily incarceration. There are violence interruption programs in the United States that are doing that kind of work, intervening in cases of violence, not with police presence, not with weapons, with de-escalation training, with other forms of training. So I think the key is to ask ourselves, what is it that we're getting from the criminal legal system, and are there other ways that we can get that same thing without using criminalization? Violence interruption in the context of arrest, I think, is one of those things. Other folks have been talking about sending out social service providers rather than police as first responders. So thinking about who that first responder might be, and then developing community-based alternatives, and that I'll talk about a little bit more later. The other place that I think it's important to situate intimate partner violence is around COVID, and looking at our rates of incarceration in the context of the COVID epidemic. As of September 15th, 2020, the UCLA COVID Behind Bars Data Project found that there were 130,000 people in United States prisons who had tested positive for COVID, and that at least 96 incarcerated people had died as a result of COVID. According to the New York Times, prisons, jails, and other correctional facilities made up 45 of the top 50 COVID cluster sites in the United States and 85 of the top 100. So asking police to intervene when the risk of infection is high and the consequences are so dire is likely chilling reporting of intimate partner violence to law enforcement. And this is especially problematic given the lack of support for the idea that criminalization is working. And what I mean by working is that it is lowering rates of intimate partner violence or deterring intimate partner violence in the United States. And that's what we'll turn to now. So there are really two big questions here. One, is criminalization working? And two, even if criminalization is working, is the cost of it too high? So as to the first question, it is not at all clear that criminalization is working, if what we mean by working is that criminalization is decreasing rates of intimate partner violence. As you can see in the United States, since 1994 and the passage of the Violence Against Women Act, rates of intimate partner violence in the United States have fallen, and they have fallen significantly. And so has the overall crime rate. Between 1994 and the year 2000, rates of intimate partner violence and the overall crime rate dropped at about the same amount. But from 2000 to 2010, rates of all crime dropped more than rates of intimate partner violence. At a time when we were pouring hundreds of millions of dollars as well as significant time and attention into the criminal legal system, we still were not even getting the same drop as the rest of the crime rate. So that seems problematic. It seems it's worth questioning whether the money and the time and the attention we're putting into criminalization are working if they're not even having the same impact as the decrease in the overall crime rate that's happening naturally. Now, since 2010, the numbers have actually gone back up. The individual incidents of intimate partner violence have increased significantly from 2010 to 2018, going up to about 800,000 in 2018, coming back down to about 700,000 in 2019, but still significantly more than in 1994 when we started keeping track. The other really startling statistic is the increase in gun homicides recently. In the United States, we've had a significant uptick in gun homicides in intimate partner violence cases, notwithstanding the focus on firearms through the Violence Against Women Act and the contention that criminalization is the only way to remove firearms from the hands of those who are abusive. So rates aren't falling, but we could still argue that criminalization was effective if it was deterring intimate partner violence. And that's a complicated question. Studies have failed to find that the existence of laws criminalizing intimate partner violence deter the behavior. So just the existence of laws doesn't deter the behavior. Arrest has effects on recidivism that range from modest to non-existent. And in some populations, arrest has been found to exacerbate violence. So Sherman said at the time of the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment, you've got to replicate. Replication is essential, and you're all social scientists, so you know this. I am not a social scientist, I only read them. But when the replications happened, they could not replicate the impact of arrest on intimate partner violence, and they could not find an impact, a consistent impact of mandatory arrest on intimate partner violence. One study found that the relationship between arrest and future risks of violence were entirely attributable to pre-arrest differences in the risk of offending. So it wasn't about the arrest at all, it was about everything that had come before. Studies on the deterrent effect of prosecution have been similarly equivocal. One study found that conviction can have an effect on recidivism, but that effect disappears when ongoing monitoring and accountability are not part of the sentence. Studies have also found that incarceration alone has no effect on recidivism, but that incarceration plus post-release monitoring can deter future violence. So what the evidence seems to show is that it's not criminalization itself that's having the effect, it's continuing to keep monitor someone, which is something that we can do outside of the criminal legal system. Now, this failure to find a strong effect can be the product of a number of different things. It could be about the inconsistent application and enforcement of the law. One criticism that I frequently get, and there's not much I can say about it, is we don't know whether the criminal legal system is working because we've never really tried it, in that laws are not uniformly and effectively enforced. There is a lack of a credible threat of punishment. Research in the United States has suggested that for the criminal legal system to act as a deterrent, punishment has to be swift and certain. The United States legal system is neither swift nor certain, and so any punishment, any deterrent value that punishment might have may be mitigated by the failure to act swiftly and with any kind of certainty. Recidivism itself is a problematic measure of deterrence for a couple of different reasons. Recidivism generally uses rearrest as its proxy. So the way that we determine whether recidivism is happening is to see if someone has become involved in the criminal legal system again. But it's entirely possible that people who've been harmed are not turning to that criminal legal system again once they found that the first time that they did so, it did not help them. And so we don't really know what the recidivism rates are when we only look at rearrest. Using rearrest as a proxy for new violence also misses non-criminal forms of abuse that can be just as harmful. So in the United States, in most places, emotional and psychological abuse are not illegal. And many times people will substitute physical abuse that will get them in trouble with the criminal legal system for emotional abuse, which won't. Questioning whether that's a good measure of deterrence, I think, is important because so many of our clients tell us that emotional abuse is just as, if not more, debilitating and more harmful than physical abuse, and that the physical abuse that they suffer is really secondary to the ongoing dismantling of someone's sense of self and personality that can come through emotional abuse. Add to all of this that intimate partner violence is underreported. Only about half of intimate partner violence ever gets reported to law enforcement in the United States in the first place, and that much of intimate partner violence is committed by the same people over and over again. And all of these things really complicate the argument around deterrence. Now, this is not to say that criminalization does not have potential benefits. So currently, criminalization is one of the few ways that we have to stop a violent incident in the moment. Criminalization certainly helps us to achieve separation through criminal orders of protection and through prosecution, conviction, and incarceration. Criminalization in the United States brings with it significant resources, including victim witness advocates and crime victim compensation. And it puts resources into the coffers of community-based organizations. So one of the things that VAWA does is to fund community-based organizations to the extent that they are assisting law enforcement with carrying out their mission. And finally, there's an argument to be made about the expressive function of the law, that criminalization says to our society that intimate partner violence is something that we do not condone, that we do not sanction, and sends a message to people to ask them not to indulge in that kind of behavior. But I would argue that the costs of criminalization are much higher than any benefits that it confers. First, criminalization is a form of what Jonathan Simon has called governing through crime, the use of the criminal legal system to address social problems in the United States. It's a neoliberal tendency to push everything into the carceral system and not provide resourcing for any other kind of address to a social problem. Criminalization has significant harms to people subjected to abuse. I told you that arrest rates increased significantly after the inception of mandatory arrest policies. They increased for one group more than anyone else, and that was women. Arrest rates of women, both singly and in what are called dual arrests, where both parties arrested, increased substantially after the passage of mandatory arrest laws. In some states, they still have not come down. And despite the passage of laws requiring police to try to identify who the primary perpetrator is before making an arrest, in some states, arrest rates of women are still significantly high. Now, that would be fine if there was evidence to show that women were committing intimate partner violence at the same rates as men, but the evidence doesn't show that. What the evidence shows is that it is the operation of mandatory arrest policies in and of themselves that are driving the increases in the arrest rate. Other harms to people subjected to abuse include the collateral consequences of increased intervention by the state. So when the state becomes involved with your family as a result of intimate partner violence, you might be more likely, for example, to have your children removed by the child welfare system, or to have other kinds of negative state interventions. There are significant harms to people of color in our system as well. The racism that infects the rest of the United States criminal legal system is certainly present in the response to intimate partner violence as well. In one example, in Milwaukee County, 24% of the population is made up of people of color, but they were 66% of the defendants in cases involving intimate partner violence. So that disproportionate enforcement of these laws against people of color is obviously a problem. Criminalization brings with it a social stigma, and criminalization has severe collateral consequences in the United States, including restrictions on the ability to vote, to access public housing, to access education grants. And so those are some of the kind of general costs of criminalization. There are three that I really want to focus on because they relate directly to some of the interventions that I think could help us. Employment. Prior to being incarcerated, 2/3 of incarcerated men are employed, about half serve as the primary source of support for their families, and I am just realizing that I never gave my disclaimer, so here's my disclaimer. Most of the research in the United States assumes male perpetrators and female victims, and so oftentimes my language defaults to male perpetrators and female victims, which is not to say that there are not male victims of intimate partner violence, that intimate partner violence does not affect trans and gender nonconforming and non-binary people, only to say that when I'm looking at some of this research, it's very specific to this kind of victim perpetrator binary. Ex-offenders in the United States earn less, they're employed less, they're often employed in bad jobs with high turnover and little earning potential. And upon release, ex-offenders find it almost impossible to find work, exponentially more difficult for men of color. Incarceration depresses wages, depresses the annual incomes of formerly incarcerated people. And as we'll talk about in just a moment, this is a particular problem in the context of intimate partner violence. People who have been involved with the criminal legal system are frequently found in unstable communities that are challenged by poverty and high unemployment rates. The loss of community members into the criminal legal system weakens community ties and deprives the community of people who should be raising children and contributing to the economy. All of this decreases the community's capacity to respond to violence, and resources are regularly being diverted out of communities and into the criminal legal system. Finally, in thinking about trauma, the violence that people experience in prison is often recycled into their interpersonal relationships. So it's particularly ironic that we are punishing people for using violence by sending them into places where they are likely to be witnesses to or victims of violence. 10 to 20% of prisoners in the United States report being physically abused. 10% of those incarcerated in state prisons report sexual abuse. And trauma leads to post-traumatic stress disorder and other mental health issues, which folks coming out of the criminal legal system then bring with them back into their post-prison relationships. And not surprisingly, post-traumatic stress disorder is highly correlated with the perpetration of intimate partner violence. So some of the specific costs of criminalization have real implications for intimate partner violence, exacerbating some of the correlates of intimate partner violence. And I think that's what's particularly problematic. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as I talk about potential solutions. So there are several things that in my book I talk about as alternatives to criminalization that focus around economics, public health, and community and human rights. I'm not going to talk about the human rights piece here so much. That's more a framing way of thinking about the way that we address intimate partner violence than about specific interventions. But I will talk about the other three in a bit of detail. So first, the research on economics. And I want to just say, you all are economists, and I am not. What I am looking at is the criminology research on intimate partner violence. You may feel differently about that. I followed recently the flap on Twitter about criminology versus economics research, and so I know that people may have thoughts about this, but this is what I understand from the criminology research. People subjected to abuse earn less and are able to work less. Intimate partner violence costs the United States economy as much as $67 billion annually. Women lose as much as $18 million annually in earnings as a result of intimate partner violence. And the effects begin as early as adolescence. So women who have been subjected to teen dating violence earn up to $3,900 less than those who did not experience violence, a deficit that is attributable to the impact on education. Healthcare costs are 19% higher for women who've been subjected to abuse. And seeking protection from abuse can result in economic penalties. So one study found that women who sought protective orders lost up to $1,018 in income the year after they asked for protection, and were never able to recoup that loss over time. Intimate partner violence is highly correlated with poverty and with other indicators of material deprivation. 2/3 of low-income women report having been subjected to abuse, and the lower the income, the more likely a woman is to have been subjected to intimate partner abuse. Women with significant debt are also more likely to be subjected to intimate partner violence. There's also a relationship between intimate partner violence and neighborhood disadvantage. Intimate partner violence is more prevalent in low-income neighborhoods, and couples who are experiencing intimate partner violence are more likely to be economically vulnerable and live in disadvantaged neighborhoods. I see that you've been talking about economic abuse, and so I won't say much about that except to say that economic abuse can prevent women from getting educations, from working, and from establishing the kind of economic independence that they might need to leave a violent situation. It's this last thing, though, that I really want to talk about. And the research shows that men who are under and unemployed are far more likely to use violence than other men. Men's poor work history predicts the risk for intimate partner violence, and male unemployment may be the single most important demographic risk factor for intimate partner violence. And that ties back to the point that I was making before about incarceration. So if we know that male under and unemployment is one of the most significant risk factors for intimate partner violence, and we know that incarceration has a significantly deleterious impact on your ability to be employed, it would seem that using an intervention that is going to make unemployment more likely would be deeply problematic. And in fact, incarceration, and it's important to note too that it's not just incarceration that has these impacts. It's any exposure to the criminal legal system, particularly if a conviction happens, whether incarceration happens or not. The penalties associated with being involved in the criminal legal system attach even if you're not incarcerated. And so those penalties make it more difficult for men to find work and to keep work, which then can make them much more likely to perpetrate intimate partner violence. So the interventions that we're using are exacerbating some of the correlates of intimate partner violence. So in the United States, there are a number of solutions that people have suggested. Most often people are talking about financial literacy programs that are designed to teach women basic financial skills. And these programs are generally successful in improving women's basic financial literacy and their sense of economic well-being. But what they assume is that what women need is to learn financial management rather than giving them access to and control over resources or redistributing wealth in any kind of meaningful way. they don't challenge the structural inequalities based on class and race that continue to contribute to the perpetration of intimate partner violence in the United States. They ignore harmful practices like predatory lending and payday loan centers that are a huge problem for low-income populations in the United States. So the primary economic intervention that people are using is fine as far as it goes, but it doesn't really get at any of the causal factors or give women any kind of real economic power. What does are things like cash transfer programs, microfinance and microenterprise, and employment training. And so cash transfer programs have been shown to significantly reduce intimate partner violence in Peru and in Ecuador. More recently, we have some kind of suggestion from the COVID stimulus funds about the impact of cash transfer programs. Research in the United States found that rates of intimate partner violence increased significantly at the beginning of COVID, but then decreased at least partially after the stimulus package money was released. And so that the relieving of economic stress, the relief of economic tension, and the provision of supports seems to have had at least a corollary impact on rates of intimate partner violence in the United States. Organizations in the United States are starting to look at cash transfer. An organization called Free From, for example, made 1,100 cash grants totaling $266,000 to survivors of intimate partner violence. 64% of survivors said they needed unrestricted cash for food, for household items, to pay utilities bills. And so putting that power into the hands of people who've experienced intimate partner violence is an important part of addressing intimate partner violence. Microfinance is something that I know you're all familiar with, and I know that you're probably also familiar with the kind of mixed research on it. In some places, microfinance has been associated with lowering rates of intimate partner violence, in other places with increasing rates of intimate partner violence. That seems to have something to do with the understanding of gender roles and the equalization of power between men and women that comes with the provision of funding, as well as the potential for conflict when money goes into the hands of women as opposed to the hands of men. But it's still, I think, an intervention worth looking at, particularly when it's coupled with training around gender, which is when the studies show rates of violence falling. Then we have to make it possible for people to work. And so programs that address intimate partner violence can also be employment programs. In Kentucky, a program called Greenhouse 17 uses the principles of therapeutic horticulture to teach residents how to engage in farming and farm-related activities, including cooking, arranging flowers, and making crafts and beauty products. Shelter residents are then able to earn income from the farm while working and learn business skills, and then have references to take with them for potential employers when they go out into the community. And the one thing that people in the United States don't like to talk about is focusing resources on people who are using violence. But in fact, if male under and unemployment is a significant driver of intimate partner violence, we need to think about how to create work for men. That's become much more difficult with the loss of manufacturing jobs in the United States. But one thing that we could do in the United States is raise the minimum wage. A 2016 report by the White House Council of Economic Advisors found that raising the minimum wage to $12 an hour by this year, the year 2020, could reduce criminal activity, which would obviously include intimate partner violence, by 3 to 5%. And so just creating a living wage for people is a significant intervention that we should be looking at. But there are also structural factors at play here. The gender pay gap, which continues to be a significant problem in the United States, is something that we need to address in order to give women the power to have actual choice. We need to look at what we replace manufacturing jobs with. And again, neoliberal economic policy that puts money into the carceral state as opposed to into building community continues to be a problem in the United States. We also need to be thinking about a public health response to intimate partner violence. Intimate partner violence are responsible for half of the femicides in the United States. Intimate partner violence drives a significant amount of hospitalization, but public health doesn't look necessarily at the health care impacts as much as at prevention. And so preventing intimate partner violence should be a significant part of any response to intimate partner violence. Working with men has a long kind of controversial history. The evidence for the effectiveness of current abuser intervention programs is mixed. Few programs have been properly evaluated, even fewer show positive results, but there are programs that are doing effective work in stopping men's violence. One of the programs that I think is really interesting is the Men Stopping Violence program in Atlanta, Georgia, where men who are enrolled in the program bring other men from their own microsystems, from their workplace or their peer group or their family, to witness some of the work that they're doing in the program, which gives those who are attending kind of a snapshot of the behavior that brought the man into the program in the first place and the effort that will be necessary to sustain that change. These community partners can then provide support and hold participants accountable for maintaining the change that they begin through the program. Another really important program in the United States has been the Strength at Home Men's Program, which is looking at the perpetration of intimate partner violence by combat veterans who are returning with post-traumatic stress disorder. So as I mentioned earlier, post-traumatic stress disorder is highly correlated with the perpetration of intimate partner violence, and it points to a real deficit in the way that we think about intimate partner violence in the United States. We have been unwilling to look at men who use violence as anything more than perpetrators, and to think about the reasons why they are using violence. Often people who are using violence have been traumatized, have experienced trauma of their own. And our failure to address that trauma is it keeping us from being able to effectively intervene in intimate partner violence. Strength at Home Men's Program is willing to kind of tackle two difficult ideas at the same time, that someone can have experienced trauma and that someone can use violence, and say it's not an excuse for the behavior, but it is an explanation for the behavior, and it's an important entry point for intervention. Because if we start to address the trauma that men have experienced, we may have a significant impact on their perpetration of intimate partner violence. Similarly, we need to stop people from experiencing trauma before it happens, and preventing adverse childhood experiences is a big part of that. A child's own victimization or exposure to a mother's abuse creates twice the risk for perpetration or victimization of intimate partner violence, and the risks are cumulative. The greater the number of adverse childhood experiences a child has, the greater the likelihood of perpetration or victimization in intimate relationships. So we need to intervene early, and we can do that through parenting programs to help prevent child abuse and neglect, through nurse-family partnerships during pregnancy, where nurses go out and visit families that may be at risk of child abuse or neglect or experiencing intimate partner violence, and do some of the work to help them deal with the issues in the family, through fatherhood programs like Fathers for Change, which looks at the intersection of substance use and intimate partner violence. All of those are designed to protect children from having the kinds of experiences that make them more likely to either experience or perpetrate intimate partner violence later on. We also have good data behind intervention with adolescents. There are a number of programs, including the Coaching Boys into Men program, the Shifting Boundaries program, the Safe Dates program, that show that you can intervene with adolescents and lower rates of intimate partner violence, increase their understanding of healthy relationships. We need to be doing that work with every kid who comes through our school system. And we can do that in school-based settings. We can do that in other kinds of settings, sports settings, for example. All of those are important intervention points. We can use edutainment, the idea that we can use entertainment to educate people. So for those of you who are in the UK, you may have followed The Archers, which is a long-running radio program in the United States. And The Archers did kind of a 2.5-year examination of intimate partner violence, which actually culminated with the wife in the relationship stabbing her abusive husband. But people who followed it were able to see this is how a violent relationship kind of is created. This is what it looks like early on. This is what it looks like when it gets acute. This is why women fight back. So using entertainment to educate people has been shown to be successful in other kinds of interventions as well. Soul City, for example, in South Africa, was able to do important work around the intersection of HIV and intimate partner violence. Finally, there are population level interventions, preventative interventions that we should be thinking about. One of them is completely not controversial, except of course in the United States, and that's to get rid of guns. Gun violence is responsible for a significant amount of intimate partner violence homicide in the United States. A woman is 5 times more likely to be killed in the United States if her partner has a gun. We need to have guns completely out of our society, but since that is not going to happen, the regulation of guns has to be much stronger if we're going to make a serious dent in intimate partner violence. Intervening around alcohol is much more controversial because people see that, again, as an excuse rather than an explanation. But the research shows that people are 11 times more likely to use violence when they are drinking, and that they're likely to cause more severe injuries and greater numbers of injuries when they're drinking. And there's some evidence to suggest that making alcohol less readily available would have a positive impact on the perpetration of intimate partner violence. And again, it's really important to think of these things not as excuses, but as explanations. It's providing context. It's helping us to understand. No one is excusing the behavior, but if we can remove some of these things that are triggering the behavior, we could lower rates of intimate partner violence. Finally, in terms of community, there are a number of community level factors that are associated with higher rates of intimate partner violence in the United States. Living in a neighborhood with high unemployment, low average male literacy rates, and concentrated poverty has a significant impact on intimate partner violence, as well as the lack of social cohesion and perception of high levels of neighborhood disorder. Also, community cynicism about the law affects intimate partner violence, as long as law is our primary response to intimate partner violence. Where community members don't believe that the law can be effective for them, there is likely to be more violence. But community can be protective as well. So in communities where women are empowered, where there are community spaces and resources and social supports exist with community, you're likely to have less intimate partner violence. Intimate partner violence is also lower in newer immigrant groups in the United States, and it's been suggested that that has to do with kind of the stronger ties among families and the greater amount of interaction among those groups. But what that suggests is that the more interaction that we are having with each other, the more of an impact we can have on lowering rates of intimate partner violence. Interacting with social networks can increase the scrutiny of a couple's relationship and prompt others to step in to protect the person who's been abused. It can allow us to bring cultural and religious prescriptions against violence to bear. It provides opportunities to confront abusive partners about their behavior. And when community is engaged, family and friends are more likely to provide the kinds of social supports that we need. The research shows that people in the United States are much more likely to go to family, friends, and community than they are to go to law enforcement. So the more that we invest in community-based responses, the greater impact that we're going to have. Even people who ultimately end up with law enforcement are more likely to turn to these other sources of support first. So one of the things that is important is to build collective efficacy. Collective efficacy reflects a community's belief in its capacity to end violence and a resulting active engagement by community residents. To exercise collective efficacy, residents have to have trust and the willingness to intervene to exercise social control. Communities with less collective efficacy, not surprisingly, have higher rates of intimate partner violence. And so building collective efficacy, again, has to be part of our solutions. So community-based interventions can really happen in 3 different ways. First, we can think about community organizing. How do we give communities the information that they need to understand intimate partner violence, to see why it's a program to address the cultural prescriptions around violence? And in one community in the Midwest, a project called the Shanti Project interacted with the Gujarati Indian community in a social marketing campaign that was designed to educate the community about the scope of intimate partner violence, stress the importance of communication and respect, and challenge traditions and values that created a context for violence. And they did this using seminars, radio announcements, and articles and publications and brochures, increased the understanding of intimate partner violence significantly, and the community declared itself more likely to be willing to intervene. But once the community is ready to intervene, they need tools to do that. And that's what community accountability is designed to do. It's designed to empower communities to respond to violence without the intervention of the police. The best known example in the United States is an organization called Creative Interventions. Creative Interventions has created a 600-page toolkit for communities who are interested in learning community accountability strategies. And the whole guiding principle of creative interventions is if a person walks through the door and says, this is what I need, we can organize a community to help them have that. One of the interesting things in the United States that's happened during the COVID epidemic is we've been talking a lot more about pod mapping. And the idea that in communities, there are specific people upon whom we can depend for specific things. And those things are called our pod. And so if I know that I can go to my neighbor when I need food, and I can go to another person when I need emotional support, and I know this person can be relied upon to take my partner out when I need them out of the home, those people become my pod. And so rather than calling the police and risking the escalation of an intervention, risking my economic support, risking my family support, having all kinds of unintended and undesired consequences, I can turn to the members of my pod for community support instead. Other organizations in the United States are training families specifically to do this kind of work. Understanding, for example, that in the LGBTQ+ community in the United States, reaching out to the police is pretty commonly seen as much more helpful. The Northwest Network in Seattle has developed the Friends Are Reaching Out program, which provides our family and friends about how to respond to intimate partner violence. And then, as I said earlier, interruption. So in Baltimore, from Safe Streets program has been intervening years. They have de-escalating with weapons. They don't go in with the same deficits that police go in with. And they are, what they have told me anecdotally is that a number of the situations that they've intervened in involved intimate partner violence. So this work is already happening with violence interrupters. It can build exists. We can think about solutions. So restorative justice, 3 questions. 1, what is the harm? 2, what was the impact of the harm? And 3, what needs to be done to redress the harm? There's conversation about restorative justice in the context of criminalization. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about restorative justice that exists independent of state-based systems that communities can turn to when they want an alternative to state. And what restorative justice provides is active accountability. Somebody has to accept responsibility for what they've done before a restorative process can start. Meetings are face-to-face. You have to connect the person that you've hurt about what the impact of that hurt was. You have to do active work to repair the harm. Now, restorative justice is both theory and practice. The theory is what I've just described to you. The practice comes in a number of different ways, including circling and conferencing. And we're not going to pick up restorative justice and put it down to replace the criminal legal system in the United States. We, in the United States, have a criminal system. It cannot do the kind of justice that restorative justice aims to do. Restorative justice is time intensive, it's labor intensive, it's not going to replace the criminal legal system. But it is another tool that people can use outside of the legal system to address intimate partner violence. Similarly, people are looking at circles of support and accountability. These engage community volunteers, professionals, and a coordinator who work together with the prime member to avoid future offending. That core member, by promising not to and to avoid situations that could create the risk of reoffending, and other community members by holding the core member. So this idea of active accountability is very much a part of any community-based intervention. Rather than having someone sit passively in a prison cell through the criminal legal system, or accountability, and of course the presumption of in the United States discourages people from accepting responsibility. I'm not suggesting we should have other than the presumption of innocence. What I am saying is that a system that tells people don't ever admit responsibility is not a system in which people are likely to take active accountability for what they've done. Finally, I think there are a number of global solutions that we need to be thinking about. First, we need to rethink violence as punishment. Violence is not going to stop violence, and the criminal legal system is an inherently violent system. I have to admit, when I wrote the book, I wrote it 4 years ago. When it came out 2 years ago, I would not have called myself a prison abolitionist. The book contains a number of reform ideas around things like decreasing violence within prison and addressing trauma in prison. There's great work going on by men's groups in prisons with the support of other men. I will say now that I would call myself a prison abolitionist, and that I don't believe that reform is ever going to really change fundamentally the conditions that lead to intimate partner violence, and that policing and criminalization are not ever going to address this problem. And so again, violence does not solve violence. So we need to rethink the use of violence as punishment, particularly because it exacerbates many of the correlates of intimate partner violence. In the United States, we also need to do a better job of thinking about what causes violence, what the origins of violence are. We have been using a traditional feminist narrative for years and years that says intimate partner violence is caused by a perpetrator's desire to have power and control over his intimate partner. And I'm not sure I think that's true. I think that power and control are the outcome of intimate partner violence, but I'm not sure they are always the goal, and that there are other things like trauma that we need to be addressing here. The traditional feminist narrative is not decreasing rates of intimate partner violence. We need to think more creatively about why people are using violence and try to target the reasons why they are using violence, as opposed to just assuming that everyone does it because they want power and control. And then finally, in the United States, we need to build a broader anti-violence movement. Anti-violence work should be anti-poverty work. That's very clear from the data. Anti-violence, anti-racism work. In the United States, when there is an incident of police brutality, all calls to police decrease significantly. The racism that is in the criminal legal system is keeping people from turning to systems of support. So as long as we're going to have criminalization, we need to make sure that it is not racist criminalization, so that it's serving people well. We need to be a mental health movement. We need to be a substance abuse movement. And until we're drawing those broader connections, we're not going to have a significant impact, I think, on intimate partner violence. So that is the pretty cover of my book. And all of the things that I've talked about are explained in much greater detail there. And that is everything that I wanted to talk about. So I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Leigh, for this extremely interesting talk and provocative as well, with some new perspectives for sure. So we're going to open the floor for questions. Please raise your hands if you have questions. Let me see. Yes, Sophia, please go ahead. Sophia, you need to unmute yourself.
Yes.
Yes.
Hi. Very interesting. Super excited. And in many aspects related to my own work in the UK and in India. And I have to say, I did buy your book yesterday because I was very excited about the whole topic, and I didn't know about your work. So, but my question is the following. So we know that in the US, the US criminal justice system has a lot of problems, and it has a variety of negative effects for people who are incarcerated and so forth and so on. But this is not necessarily true for other contexts. For example, in Norway, we see that this is not necessarily the case because the emphasis is put on reintegration of people in society. So this is in general for typically non-domestic violence cases. My point was whether what you are saying against policing, against more focus on non-policing, non-legal, decriminalizing domestic violence, if this is very specific to the US, or if you think this is something that should be much more included in other contexts where it's not necessarily the truth that the criminal justice system is not working.
So Norway is actually one of the examples when I wrote about prison reform in the book that I write about, because I think that, of all the places that are incarcerating people, there are places that are doing it in a much more humane manner. There are absolutely places that share the same problems as the United States. I've done a fair amount of work in Australia, and I would argue that Australia has many of the same problems as the United States in terms of the racism of the criminal legal system, in terms of the harshness of the criminal legal system, and the ways in which women are being caught up in the criminal legal system. I think that I don't have research from other places, and I think it would be really interesting to know that. What I do know, as I said, at the very beginning, is that we are exporting our ideas about criminalization to countries all over the world without having a really strong understanding of what the context is in those countries. And we're not generally exporting to countries like Norway that have a super strong social safety net and really progressive views about incarceration. We're exporting to, I've talked to groups from Pakistan. It's very funny because the State Department brings me in, and every time they do, I say, you know what I'm going to say, right? Like I'm going to say everything else that you're going to say see on this entire trip is a problem. And they say, yes, we like you to be controversial, so whatever. But Pakistan, I've talked to groups from Afghanistan, I've talked to groups from Georgia, places where I don't think there's the kind of social safety net or the progressive views on incarceration that there are in Norway. And so it would be interesting to know that, and the research just doesn't exist about the impact of criminalization in those places. I will say though, there's kind of two arguments about this, and one is about the harms that criminalization does, but the other is just about whether criminalization really lowers rates of violence at all. And I think that would be an interesting thing to look at in those countries, even where there are progressive social policies. There's a whole movement, you'll know because you work in the UK right now, around criminalizing coercive control. And I haven't seen any data that suggests that the criminalization of coercive control, even given that the understanding of intimate partner violence embodied in those laws is much more sophisticated than just laws criminalizing assault, is having a significant impact on rates of perpetration. So I think there are those interesting questions to ask. I don't have answers to them. I have suspicions. And I know, in Australia, which is the place whose research I know the best, they are absolutely having many of the same problems, including, and I didn't talk about this as much as I would have, most of my work now is in representing criminalized survivors. So people who have been subjected to intimate partner violence and have either fought back or as a result of that violence been criminalized. And in Australia, those rates are similarly high as they are here. So that's another kind of unintended consequence of criminalization that doesn't have to do with necessarily the harshness of the system. It's just about the way the system operates.
Thank you.
Thank you, great. And Paul Seabright, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Leigh. That was a really very, very interesting talk with a huge amount of food for thought. I have a question about something which you didn't discuss very much as an alternative to either criminalization, about which you talked a lot, or what you might think of as more constructive work reducing rates of IPV within the context of ongoing family relationships. And that is making it easier for the intimate partners to separate. Now, I can understand that there could be adverse effects on perpetrators of IPV if, for example, it's more difficult for them to get access to their children, or I can kind of anticipate lots of stuff. But you didn't talk about that as an alternative, and I just wonder if you could give us some thoughts about that.
In the United States, there's data that suggests that the rates of intimate partner violence don't decrease after separation. And that in fact, there's a whole phenomenon that was named by a law professor named Marnie Mahoney called separation-related violence. And so in some ways, we have argued in the United States that the belief that separation alone is sufficient to end intimate partner violence is problematic because of the post-separation violence that we continue to see. That being said, I am a family law attorney. I do divorces, I do protective orders, I do all of those things that enable people to separate. And certainly, the more liberal legal regimes that make it easier for people to end their relationships intuitively would have a positive impact on perpetration of intimate partner violence, just in that there wouldn't be as many people stuck together. I think COVID actually is providing support for that thesis, because rates of violence are going up as people are stuck in isolation together. So yeah, I think intuitively that's right. It's part of kind of a larger conversation though about post-separation violence and the root causes of violence. So the separation alone isn't addressing what was causing the violence in the first place, and the failure to address that means that people are not safe even after they separate. Protective orders are kind of a whole other conversation. There's a whole legal regime in the United States and in other places that enable you to go to civil court and ask for an order to keep someone away from you. Generally in the United States, what the research shows is that if you are likely to be deterred by the penalties for the violation of an order, you'll follow the order. And if you are unlikely to be deterred by the penalties for the violation of the order, which tend to be criminal penalties, you won't. Some people have argued that protective orders are simply pieces of paper. Certainly, I can give you 100 examples of people who kind of did everything right and got protective orders and were harmed again anyway, or even killed anyway. But there are also a significant number of people for whom protective orders are effective. And so providing access to those civil legal remedies, I think, is important.
Yeah, can I just have a quick comeback on that? I mean, I take all you say, and that seems very persuasive to me. But of course, separation doesn't necessarily have to be just about giving people legal powers to separate. It's also about things like, providing refuges. It's about maybe helping them get human networks of support, which mean that when a violent ex-partner comes around, they can call friends who can come and be with them. And there's a whole bunch of things you could do without necessarily acting on the legal powers of separation that could act in positive ways there. But they would be, the point, as it were, would be, again, this point about increasing the outside option for women, which isn't necessarily an outside option they'd always want to take, but if the outside option is more credible and more attractive, that may also affect the within relationship dynamics.
I could not agree with you more, and I think that's a huge part of what community accountability is meant to be, is to create those networks in community among various sources of support, some of which may be formal sources of support like shelter or refuge or community-based agencies, some of which is about developing friends and family community capacity to do that kind of intervention to help people stay safe. In the creative interventions example, for example, they talk about a woman who was partnered with a police officer and so felt very strongly that she could not possibly call the police because there was no real recourse for her there. She would be calling her partner's friends, and instead had community members created a phone tree so that when she felt unsafe, she was able to turn to those community members and say, I need your help to keep him away from me. Can you come sit with me? Can you provide support to me? And her mother went and talked to the partner and said, you need to stay away from her. And here's why: because her mother had some degree of influence over him. And his friends said, we will help you to keep him away. So enforcing that kind of separation within the community, I think, is absolutely part of what I'm talking about.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more questions from the audience? Let me check the hands if they're raised. None for now. I will have a question, Leigh. So I understand. So the measures that you mentioned as possible ways to tackling domestic violence, understanding the causes and having community involvement, etc. They're not necessarily alternative to criminalization per se. And of course, I understand that you have a problem with incarceration, given what it means. But I'm wondering also if you think that there is a sort of crowding out of a criminalization toward these other measures, and whether that will be, why that will be the case. If it's a matter of resources, we don't do more because criminalization absorbs a lot of resources, or also we kind of get more a license, we are doing it, there is criminalization, so there is not much more. Do you think that there is this trade-off, or it's not part of your reflection?
That is absolutely part of my reflection, and something I would usually say, that both of those things that you've said, I think, are absolutely true. First, criminalization is absorbing tremendous amounts of resources in the United States, right? That's the whole idea of governing through crime, is that we're taking resources that could go into communities, that could go into all kinds of other things, and they all go to the criminal legal system to solve our social problems. And that's a huge problem. Funding is a zero-sum game. Money that goes to one place can't go someplace else. But I also think that criminalization takes up all of the creative space for thought about alternatives. And people are so afraid of leaving that system because they don't know what they would turn to, that it's stymieing innovation. It's keeping us from being able to develop alternatives. Had, again, in 2018, it's about 840,000 incidents of intimate partner violence. That's not a system that's working, but people are so afraid that they can't see it's failing. If that almost 1 million incidents, we are limited by our creativity. And I think you could start alongside the criminal legal system. One, they're not mutually exclusive. You're absolutely right. And for lawyering, where the client is kind of the focus, it's called client-centered lawyering. I still have clients very hard time saying to them, you don't get to want that anymore. When the only kind of justice that we offer people is this retributive justice, it's not surprising that that's what they want. I hope that we get to a place where people can see justice individually, that they can see for themselves what justice means to me is this, and that we have ways to provide that to them. But that requires creativity, and that requires a willingness to innovate. And the criminal legal system is choking all of that out, because as long as that system continues to be dominant, we won't have the psychic space or the money to try any of these other things. And so I've argued, for example, in the United States, for a non-carceral VAWA, that we need to stop. The money that VAWA sends into police and law enforcement is giving them money to do things they're supposed to do anyway. So I don't know why we need to keep giving them those hundreds of millions of dollars when that money could be spent so much more productively in other ways that might have real impacts, particularly for that half of people who never call law enforcement in the first place. Okay, so yes, agree with you completely.
Thank you. Very interesting. So we have 2 minutes left, but we do have one more question that Sonia wants to ask. And since I think the discussion is so good, this discussion, I think we should take that question and we'll try to keep it short if possible. So Sonia, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Leigh. That was really interesting. I have one follow-up question. You mentioned that it's recognized that unemployment is a very strong predictor of IPV. I just wondered if in the US there is public policy debate about the capacity for unemployment insurance to mitigate IPV.
Very little. That's an easy question to answer. Very little. There's a real unwillingness at least in the anti-violence community, to focus on people who use violence. It's because it feels like you're excusing that violence. And so even though the research is very clear about the impact of unemployment, there is very little conversation about the use of unemployment insurance or any other remedy, job training, job assistance, skills training, education to mitigate intimate partner violence. It just doesn't happen.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I think time is up, and I would like to thank you, Leigh, again once more for this wonderful talk and this very refreshing new perspective. I'm sure the audience appreciated as well. So now we're going into a 10 minutes break before we start our sequence of papers on COVID and domestic violence. So we start again at 2:40. So I hope many of you can come back. And thanks again once more, Professor Goodmark.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.